I would like to start with land acknowledgement because it's important to recognize that Vanier College is situated in Jojage or Montreal, unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka or the Mohawk people, who were part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Unceded lands mean that the Kanien'kehá:ka people never agreed to give up their land to the colonial powers or to the Canadian state. We acknowledge the injustices and systemic racism the Indigenous community have faced since colonialism and try to work towards education, reconciliation, and more respectful, equal, and mutual relationship amongst our nations. I'm very grateful to the Kanien'kehá:ka that have been the faithful custodian of this land for many thousands of years and are still doing this work today. I have learned from them the importance of being grateful for all of nature, including the water, the forest, the air, the fire, the animals, the plants, the rock, the sun, the moon, and the stars. I want to thank everyone that made this fantastic symposium possible, the Faculty of General Education, the Teachers Association, and the Student Association. Because of you, we can make this happen. For communication, specifically Brandon Calder, Bruce Norton, thank you. Students, Michaela, Ocean, Sydney, and David Scott, Carlos Avila, and Student Development and Service Office, Maria Grant, as well as Lily and the entire Humanities Symposium Committee. Now, time to introduce Dr. Emily Weiss. Dr. Emily Weiss is a PhD candidate in the New School of Social Research in New York. Her research includes exploring the association between the feeling of boredom and the illusion of temporal slowing when everything takes forever. The relationship between boredom and various forms of psychopathology include hoarding disorder and boredom during the COVID-19 pandemic. She's also the current lab manager of the psychopathology lab of the same New School of Social Research in New York City. She practices dialectical behavior therapy. She explains that this type of therapy is about balance between acceptance and change. It helps clients develop skill in 4 domains: interpersonal effectiveness, mindfulness, distress tolerance, and emotional regulation. I can't wait to hear more about this because I think I need this. She's also completing a clinical placement at Yale. She's leading an intensive outpatient program. This is a group-based. They meet 3 times a week and serve adults with a variety of psychiatric concerns, such as borderline personality disorder and other personality disorders such as bipolar, eating disorder, trauma, and self-injury. Something interesting too is a lot of our patients also have a significance of comorbidity with substance use disorder, which I think we need to hear about. So thank you, welcome, and I'll let you speak.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Oh, I'm hearing a bit of an echo in the auditorium. I think it might have stopped. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. All right. You should all be seeing a slide that says boredom, time perception, and psychiatric illness. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah.
Great, I see a thumbs up. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Weiss. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really honored to be here and for this opportunity to talk to you about boredom. So I'm a 4th-year clinical psychology PhD candidate at the New School for Social Research in New York City. And my research does primarily focus on boredom and psychiatric conditions, but I've also studied boredom in relation to time perception. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the research in the field, as well as some of the research that my lab has done. Okay, so to start us out today and wake us all up, I'd like you to take a look at the pictures on the screen. These are some posts that I found on social media at the beginning of the pandemic, so around April 2020, when most things were closed and most places were locked down. If you had to take a guess what emotion the person who made these was feeling, what would you say? You just had one guess.
Bored.
I'm going to guess. Oh, I heard someone jump in with boredom. So my guess would be that you might have looked at those pictures and many of you might have come to the conclusion that these people were probably bored. And maybe one of the reasons why you might have found those pictures somewhat amusing is because they're relatable. I'm sure at least some of us can relate to being so bored that we do things like count ceiling tiles or the holes in our laundry basket. So I hope when you leave this symposium, you'll realize that boredom is actually pretty interesting. But until relatively recently, it's been overlooked in scientific study. And if you think about it, that's actually pretty surprising, right? Boredom is such a universal experience, and it's a feeling that appears to affect everybody from time to time. Studies have shown that even non-human animals can experience boredom. So to highlight that, I'd like you all to just take a minute to think about these questions on the slide. Have you ever felt bored? That might seem like a silly question, right? Because it's such a common experience. But if you take a moment to really think about it, it might be more complex than you initially thought. How do you know when you're bored? What are some signals that tell you you're experiencing boredom? And then what do you do about it? Do you try to escape it? Do you try to distract yourself from it? What do you do next? So before we get into today's discussion, let's first take a minute to define what we mean when we say, I'm bored. What is boredom? It might seem like there's a simple answer to this question, but actually researchers haven't yet come to a final consensus on the definition of boredom. Boredom has been defined as a state of wanting, but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. It has been defined as an aversive feeling state. Like other feeling states, it's thought to have an adaptive or evolutionary function. One of the functions of boredom might be to signal us that the current activity we're engaged in is not satisfactory. It might arise when we realize that we've invested our attentional resources in a task that, for one reason or another, is giving us less of an optimal return on that investment. But crucially, there are constraints on our ability to seek out other sources of engagement. These constraints might be external. They might be out in the environment. So for example, maybe you're sitting in a lecture where the speaker is just really not engaging and presents all the material in a very monotonous tone of voice. But you need to sit through that lecture for course credit. Of course, I hope that's not your experience today. These constraints can also be internal. For example, your beliefs about the task and how you can integrate what you'll learn from it into your existing values and knowledge. So let's say you had to sit through a 40-minute lecture on how to do single-digit addition, like 2 + 2. It would probably be way too easy to integrate that information, and that would lead to feelings of sameness and boredom. On the other hand, let's say you had to sit through a lecture that is called Honors Advanced Calculus and Linear Algebra, which is listed on Wikipedia as one of the hardest university math courses. If you're anything like me, that information might be way too difficult for you to integrate, and this too could lead to feelings of boredom. So to break down boredom a little bit more, let's talk about two components of boredom that are related, but are not the exact same thing. State boredom is often what we experience as the subjective experience of boredom. This is thought to be associated with the environment and is also called situation-dependent boredom. State boredom arises when you're in an environment that, for whatever reason, is uninteresting, and you can't change or leave that environment. So to go back to the example of the class or lecture that's really not interesting to you, but you can't leave because it's required, that would probably be an example of state boredom. As soon as that class period ends and the constraints that are keeping you in the boring situation are removed, the feeling of boredom should also go away. In other words, you probably won't find yourself still feeling bored after you've left the room and you're free to use your phone, talk to your friends, and otherwise just direct your attention to other things. The other component of boredom I want to highlight is called trait boredom or boredom proneness. This refers to a more stable trait-like characteristic that differs between people. Because it's not thought to be a result of situational factors, it's sometimes called situation-independent boredom. Boredom proneness refers to a person's tendency or vulnerability to the experience of boredom. A person who has high levels of boredom proneness tends to become bored more easily and more frequently. It's possible that individuals who have high levels of trait boredom have difficulty using coping mechanisms that we all need to use to effectively manage the boring situations we face pretty much every day. For example, let's say you're in a really long line at a grocery store. That's a situation that probably we've been in at one point or another, and one that's not particularly engaging. Some people might employ coping mechanisms to manage that situation, such as daydreaming while they're in the line, and this may result in them feeling less bored. So when we say I'm bored, it's really the interaction of our contextual situation and our individual vulnerability to experience boredom. There are a few reasons why the distinction between state boredom and boredom proneness is important. So you might expect that someone who's high in boredom proneness is more likely to experience boredom more frequently, right? But what about the opposite? Is someone who experiences state boredom frequently always more likely to be boredom prone? That's where it gets a little more complicated. There might be situational factors that make boredom unavoidable, even for people who are not particularly boredom prone. One example is when the world went into lockdown at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's likely that instances of boredom rose for many people, even those who weren't particularly vulnerable to boredom. In our lab, we looked at people's boredom levels starting at the end of March 2020 until the beginning of July 2020, so really the first few months of the pandemic. And at each time point, we included about 200 separate individuals from the United States. As you can see from the graph here, people did report some increased rate of boredom experiences over those first few months. We also had the opportunity to compare the average rates of boredom during the first few months of the pandemic to average rates of boredom before the pandemic. Here, we compared our sample of adults to a separate group over 1,000 adults from the United States using data that our lab had collected before the pandemic started. Here too, we found that on average, adults were reporting more frequent episodes of boredom during the early stages of the pandemic than even just shortly before it began. So if boredom is a state that everyone experiences, and a lot of the time it's temporary and can be resolved by changing your environment, why is boredom worth studying? Why should we care about boredom? As I hope you'll see today, while boredom can be a temporary nuisance, other times it can have serious implications. It can alter the way that we perceive time, and it's also related to our mental health and even our physical health. As we'll talk about today, boredom is associated with a number of mental health concerns, but it's a factor that's often been overlooked in clinical settings. Not only is it associated with mental health concerns, it is associated with our physical health as well. One study showed that higher rates of boredom proneness were associated with more physical health symptoms. And a large study demonstrated that reporting more boredom was not only associated with poorer physical health, but it was also associated with earlier death. This study suggested that high levels of boredom may drive people to engage in riskier health-related behaviors, such as drinking excessively. And other research has shown that in some cases, we will go to great lengths to escape boredom. It can even drive us to engage in behaviors that we wouldn't normally choose, and that overall may be harmful to our well-being. In non-human animals, this can look like approaching a potentially aversive stimulus. In humans, this can look like risk-taking behaviors. Or even, as we'll see later on, resorting to self-administering electric shocks to escape the feeling. So, in line with the idea that boredom can lead to risky behaviors, recent research suggests that boredom proneness is also associated with a specific type of risk-taking that's become increasingly relevant over the past 2 years. In other words, boredom has been associated with how people responded to the pandemic. In a recent study of almost 1,000 adults, the results showed that people who were high in boredom proneness were more likely to report rule-breaking behaviors in relation to pandemic social distancing. And individuals who are higher in boredom proneness were also more likely to report that they tested positive for COVID during the early stages of the pandemic. In our lab, we also looked at people's responses to the pandemic and how that related to their boredom levels. In our study, which contained almost 800 adults from the United States, we found very similar results. Early on in the pandemic, people who tested positive for COVID-19 also reported higher levels of both boredom proneness and state boredom, but this effect was stronger for boredom proneness. So I hope that this introduction can show you that boredom is actually a really relevant factor, both in terms of the current times we're living in and in our broader experience of the world in general. So let's start out talking about boredom and time perception. Before we get into talking about how boredom relates to our experience of time, let's first talk a little bit about what time perception is. So time perception is complex. As you might have realized already, our experience of time doesn't always correspond with clock time. Sometimes an hour feels like it passes by in the blink of an eye, and other times an hour can feel like it's dragging on for eternity. But as far as the clock is concerned, those 2 hours were exactly equal. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about why it is that our experience of time can vary so drastically. Some factors that can influence our experience include our emotions like boredom, but also things like sadness, anger, and certain personality traits like impulsivity can also affect how we perceive time. Our experience of time even varies based on the type of timing judgment we're trying to make. So what are these different timing judgments? Broadly, we can divide our perception of time into 2 categories: interval length judgments and passage of time judgments. Interval length judgments happen when we have to estimate how much time has passed. This can be further broken down into 2 more types of judgments, which are called prospective and retrospective, that we're going to cover next. On the other hand, passage of time judgments simply refer to how slow or fast time feels like it's passing. Each of these timing judgments is affected by different contextual factors. And even more interesting, they don't always line up with each other. So before we really get into talking about these different types of timing, I have another question for you. Let's take a look at these 2 scenarios. And my question for you is, which one is longer? So in the first one, let's say you're at the doctor's office and you're told you have a 30-minute wait to see the doctor. You realize that your phone battery is on 0% and you didn't bring anything else to do with you. So you have nothing to do while you wait. Now, let's say you're at the doctor's office again and again are told it's going to be a 30-minute wait. This time you came prepared and your phone is on full battery and you also realize there's free Wi-Fi in the room. Of course, objectively, they're the same amount of time. It says in the prompt that you're waiting at the doctor's office for 30 minutes. But as you think about yourself and imagine yourself in each of these situations, do these 30 minutes feel equal to you? Or do you imagine that one situation might feel like it's taking longer than the other, and which one? I'm going to take a guess that many of you probably said that waiting for 30 minutes with nothing to do might feel longer than waiting for 30 minutes when you have access to your phone. But since both are 30 minutes and they're objectively the same length of time, what causes this difference? One theory, called the Attentional Gait model, holds that this is because of how we're dividing our attention. In this case, you know that you have to wait 30 minutes. And when you know the length of time that you have to judge, this is called a prospective interval judgment. Basically, at any given point, your attentional resources are split between paying attention to time and paying attention to whatever task you're performing. The more attentional resources that you dedicate to time, the longer you're going to estimate that interval to be. So when tasks are really simple, you have more attentional resources that are left over to use for monitoring time. Related to that, when tasks are really unpleasant, you might divert your attention to the passing of time because you want the experience to be over. So in our 2 examples of waiting at the doctor's office with nothing to do, you might pay more attention to time for 2 different reasons. 1, because there isn't much else to do. So you have more attentional resources available to think about time. And 2, because the task of sitting and doing nothing might be really unpleasant for you. So you focus your attention on time because you want the experience to end. But ironically, in both cases, that 30 minutes is going to feel longer. On the other side of this, when tasks are complex, then we're going to need more attentional resources to dedicate to them. This means that there are going to be fewer attentional resources left over to use for time. So when fewer resources are dedicated to timing, the interval that passes by is going to be judged as shorter. So going back to our example of the doctor's office, let's say your phone is on 100% battery and you find an article about a topic that really interests you, maybe boredom. You're going to expend your attentional resources on reading the article and much fewer on attending to timing the 30 minutes that you have to wait. This is ultimately going to lead you to judge the interval as relatively short. Now, let's take another example. This time, let's say you wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday and you have nothing to do that day. So you decide to stay home and watch TV, and then you go to bed at midnight. And then the next day, now let's say you wake up at 8 a.m. again and it's Monday, and you have a really busy day ahead of you. You have school, you have work, you also have some social activities, and you're running around pretty much all day until you go to bed again at midnight. In both cases, you're awake for the same number of hours. But if on Tuesday you were asked which day is longer, what would you say? Here, I take a guess that maybe you said the day where you're running around all day might be remembered as longer than the day where you just stayed home watching TV. But here too, objectively, the same amount of time has passed. So why might one be remembered as longer than the other? This type of timing judgment is called a retrospective estimation. You make a retrospective estimation when you don't know ahead of time that you're going to have to judge the interval. According to one theory, which is called the contextual change model, these judgments are largely based on our memory of the event. So in order to make a retrospective timing judgment, you have to recall things that are relevant to that interval of time. So the more changes that occurred over that period of time, the more information you can recall. This should cause you to judge the interval as lasting longer. So in our two examples, when you think about the day you had on Sunday, there weren't too many contextual changes because you just stayed home to watch TV. So retrospectively, you might recall that day as shorter. But when you think about your day on Monday, you might remember that you went to class, that you met up with friends, that you studied, that you commuted between these activities, and so on. So in other words, there were a lot of contextual changes. This might lead you to recall that day retrospectively as being longer. And finally, there is a third type of timing judgment that's called a passage of time judgment. This differs from the other two because here you're not asked to estimate a duration. You're asked to rate how quickly or slowly time seems to be passing. So as I mentioned earlier, some of these judgments can give us different results. For instance, you might feel like time has passed really slowly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll underestimate how much time has actually passed. In other words, you can still accurately judge a duration of an interval, even if you feel like it moves slowly. In addition to that, whether we're making a retrospective or prospective judgment can also affect how we perceive time. So let's do one more example. This time, let's say you're put on hold while making a phone call, and you're told that you're going to have to wait for 5 minutes. Chances are you might spend a lot of that 5 minutes thinking about how long that 5 minutes seems because you have nothing else to capture your attention. This is a prospective judgment. But if you're just put on hold without a specified time limit, you might feel in the moment like time is passing really slowly. But if you're later asked to recall how long you were on hold for, you might actually underestimate that interval because there aren't a lot of changes you can recall. So all of this is really just to highlight that the way we perceive time is certainly not always objective, and it's influenced by so many different contextual factors. So now we know a little bit about how we perceive time, but how does boredom fit into this? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the phrase, time flies when you're having fun. And I hope that you can see from what we've talked about so far that, at least in a subjective sense, this is somewhat accurate. Research has shown that if we experimentally alter how fast time seems to be passing, people report a change in how they experience a task. So in one series of studies, participants were divided into two groups. In one group, time was manipulated to move faster than they thought it would. And in another group, time was altered to move slower than they expected that it would. The researchers then asked participants to engage in a few different tasks. These included listening to an irritating sound, performing a repetitive task, and also listening to a song that they liked. Participants who were assigned to the condition where time moved unexpectedly fast found that the irritating sound was less annoying. They thought the repetitive task was more enjoyable, and they also rated the good song as better compared to the participants who were assigned to the condition where time moved unexpectedly slow. So if time flies when we're having fun, what happens to time when we're bored? Does boredom seem to make time drag? Numerous studies have attempted to answer this question and have found some really interesting results. Some studies have looked at trait levels of boredom and how this affects time perception. In one study, participants were recruited who were either high or low in boredom proneness, and they were asked to perform a boring task where they circled numbers on a page for a specified length of time. Participants who were high in boredom proneness felt that time was moving slower than participants who were low in boredom proneness, even though they all completed the same task. A later study looked at participants again who were high and low in boredom proneness, and this time asked them to provide estimates of brief intervals that ranged from 2 seconds to 1 minute. So they had to estimate how long that interval was. This study showed that the participants who were low in boredom proneness tended to underestimate how much time had passed compared to the highly boredom prone participants. So overall, these findings suggest that even just having a vulnerability to experience boredom or a tendency to experience boredom can affect how we perceive and process time. While these studies explored the role of boredom proneness, other studies have looked at the impact that state boredom can have on time perception. In these studies, researchers have manipulated time progression to make it appear as if time was moving either faster or slower than participants expected. One of the first studies demonstrating this effect took place in the 1970s. In this study, participants were asked to write stories in a laboratory setting. Each participant worked on the story writing task for 20 minutes. But the researchers rigged the clock in the room. For some participants, it appeared that 30 minutes had passed by while they were doing the activity. But for others, it appeared that only 10 minutes had passed by while they were doing the activity. So in other words, for participants who were in the 10-minute group, time moved unexpectedly slow. But for participants in the 30-minute group, time moved unexpectedly fast. Even though all participants worked on the same task for the same amount of time, the participants who thought time was moving slower than it should rated the task as more boring and less interesting. A more recent study replicated these findings using a virtual reality task. In this time, participants were told that they would be engaging in a virtual reality environment for 10 minutes. But some participants were stopped after only 5 minutes, and others remained in the virtual reality task for 20 minutes before the researchers told them to stop. And like previous findings, the participants who felt like time moved slower than they expected it to rated the task as being more boring. Other researchers have shown that this kind of works the other way too. So even subjecting participants to a boring environment can result in the perception that time is passing slower. In one study, participants were assigned to either watch 9 minutes of an action movie or spend 9 minutes sitting in a waiting room doing nothing. Like you'd probably expect, this study showed that even though the amount of time was objectively the same in both conditions, the participants who were assigned to a condition that was probably pretty boring rated time as moving slower. And finally, other researchers have shown that even just the expectation that something will be boring can result in feeling like time is slowed down. In this study, participants again completed a virtual reality task. Half were told ahead of time that it was going to be really interesting and really engaging. The other half, though, were told that it was going to be pretty boring, but to do their best to stay engaged. All participants were exposed to the same task for the same amount of time. But after it was over, the participants who were told it was going to be boring not only found it more boring, but they also reported that time had passed slower, compared to the participants who were told that it would be interesting. So in summary, boredom and time perception do appear to be related. It seems that in some way, boredom can make you feel like time is dragging. And when time is dragging, you might find yourself feeling bored. But what if we give participants a task that's designed to induce boredom, and then we manipulate how fast or slow time is moving? Would the boring task be less aversive when time moves faster than you expect? Would it be even more aversive when time moves slower than you expect? And what role does boredom proneness play? The previous studies of boredom and time progression focused on either boredom proneness or current boredom. But as we know, both are important to consider. So we decided to conduct a study to look at these questions. We expected that if participants were made to think that time was passing unexpectedly fast, they would rate a boring task more positively. And if time was passing unexpectedly slow, they would rate a boring task more negatively. So we conducted this study with a group of participants from a large university in the Northeast United States. In total, we had 72 graduate or undergraduate students who participated in the study. About 80% of them identified as female, half identified as white, and on average, participants were 23. Participants came into our labs to complete a study that they believed was about reading processes. We didn't tell them it was about boredom at the beginning, or else that might have altered how they responded to the study. First, we had them fill out a self-report questionnaire that was designed to assess levels of boredom proneness, and they also answered some demographic questions. After this, we asked them to remove their watches and their rings and to place their cell phones out of sight. We told them that this was to minimize distractions, but it was actually to prevent participants from looking at the clock during the experiment. We also made sure that there were no clocks visible anywhere in the lab room. Next, we administered a task that's designed to induce feelings of boredom. So I have a sample up on the screen here. And as you can see, we gave participants a packet of papers with a short story. We told them that their task was to count up all the vowels in the story and then periodically add them up and place the sum in a little box that we had scattered throughout the text. We told them to do their best not to make mistakes because we were going to assess how many errors they made. We then set a timer for 10 minutes and we told participants they could stop counting the vowels when the timer went off. Importantly though, the timer itself was not visible to the participant. So even though all participants completed the task for 10 minutes in reality, the way we manipulated time progression was giving them different instructions. So in our time flies group, we told participants that they would work on the task for 15 minutes before stopping. So they believed that the timer was set for 15 minutes. In our real-time condition, we told participants that they'd be working on the task for 10 minutes before stopping. So in this case, the participants were given accurate information about how much time would pass. And then finally, in our time drags condition, participants were told that they would work on the task for just 5 minutes. So in this case, they were led to believe that the timer would go off after 5 minutes had elapsed. After the timer went off, we asked participants to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 their passage of time judgment. So how quickly did time seem to pass for them? Lower ratings meant time seemed to drag, while higher ratings meant time seemed to fly. Next, we asked them to rate their experience of the vowel counting task. We asked them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 about how anxiety-provoking, enjoyable, boring, amusing, and tedious they found it to be. When we looked at the results, we found that, like previous studies, even though all participants spent 10 minutes on the task, there were differences in how quickly or slowly time felt like it was passing for them. Specifically, participants who were in our time drags group, where they believed they'd spent 5 minutes on the task, rated time as moving slower than participants in the other two groups. Interestingly though, whether participants were led to believe they spent 10 or 15 minutes on the task didn't make a difference in terms of how slow or fast they rated the time progression. We also found that even though all participants performed the same task for the same length of time, there were differences in how they rated it. Specifically, participants who believed only 5 minutes had passed rated the task as being more aversive than participants who believed that 15 minutes had passed. This difference remained even when we accounted for the individual differences in boredom proneness. So in this study, we found that when time is made to feel like it's passing slower than you'd expect, a boring task does seem more unpleasant. And this is the case even though the objective amount of time that has passed was equal across study participants. So what might explain this illusion between boredom and temporal slowing? One possibility is to go back to the definition of boredom as having an adaptive evolutionary function. It might tell us that the current task or environment is not meeting our needs. Its purpose is to tell us that we need to move on. So when we invest our attentional resources in something and we find that what we're getting in return is suboptimal, boredom might arise. There are a few reasons why this could happen. One reason is that we're constrained to invest more attentional resources into something than we're willing to. This can also be called attentional overinvestment. So this might have happened to the study participants. In our time drags group, participants went into the study expecting to invest 5 minutes into a task that on its own was not really engaging or meaningful. But because in reality, they spent 10 minutes doing the task, they started to feel like they'd invested more resources than they'd originally planned. And so they started to feel more negatively towards the task. On the other hand, participants in our Time Flies group expected that they would invest 15 minutes of their time. These participants actually got more than expected for their investment. They were stopped after 10 minutes. So this might have led participants to believe that their investment was worthwhile, and so they rated the task more positively. In all cases, though, they were all constrained from allocating their attentional resources to something else. They thought that we were assessing how many mistakes they made, so they couldn't, just pass the time by daydreaming or even looking around at other things in the room. So what can the boredom and temporal slowing illusion tell us about real life? It might have important implications for things like motivation and effort. As past research has suggested, if you feel like time is moving slower than it is, you might feel as if you've been putting more effort into a task for an extended period of time, but it's still not done, or you still haven't gotten as far as you think you should have. This might result in you feeling very frustrated or very impatient with the task, and it might result in a higher chance of you failing to see the task through to the end and quitting before it's over. So, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to affecting how we perceive time, boredom is also related to our mental health. Boredom has been related to quite a few psychiatric conditions in the literature, but it's also a factor that's been largely overlooked in many clinical settings. Today, we're briefly going to cover some of the key findings that link boredom to some of these conditions. And I hope you'll see from our discussion that boredom is quite relevant to our mental health and well-being and deserving of more attention in mental health settings. I do also want to quickly note that we will be touching on some subjects that might be sensitive, including self-injury, substance use, and eating disorders. After we talk a little bit about boredom's role in mental health more generally, we'll talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done in our lab looking at boredom in a specific form of psychopathology, which is compulsive object hoarding or hoarding disorder. Perhaps one of the most well-documented associations between that's in the literature is between boredom and symptoms of depression. Interestingly, like boredom, studies have shown that depression is also associated with slowed time perception. Particularly, depression has been associated with slowed passage of time judgments like boredom has. Across the decades, many studies have shown that boredom and depression are closely linked. But studies have also demonstrated that even though they do share a relationship, they aren't the same thing. So they are related but separate emotional states. The relationship between boredom and depression has been studied in a variety of ways. And across these findings, researchers have consistently found that boredom proneness, state boredom, and episodes of recent and frequent boredom are all associated with increased symptoms of depression. But does depression cause people to experience boredom more frequently, or does boredom lead to depression? Unfortunately, Most of the research on this topic has been correlational, so this is a complex answer that we don't yet have a complete or definitive answer to. A behavior that sometimes co-occurs with depression is self-injury or non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors. These behaviors can include things like cutting, burning, or hitting oneself. Even though the behavior brings some physical harm to the person, the intention is not for them to die or for them to end their life. Some people report engaging in self-injury in order to regulate emotions, high emotional distress, or even to feel something. It might not be surprising then to find out that there is a relationship between boredom and inflicting pain on yourself. In one study, participants were left alone in a room for 15 minutes. They were instructed just to be alone with their thoughts, and as such, they didn't have access to their phones or any other type of material that they could engage with. But they were given the option to administer an electric shock to themselves. Before the study, participants were asked if they had $5, would they pay money not to receive an electric shock? The researchers asked this as a way of assessing whether participants found the idea of getting an electric shock to be unpleasant and whether they would prefer to avoid it if they had the option to avoid it. Interestingly, after being left alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes, many participants chose to shock themselves at least once, even though they had said before that they would pay money to avoid it. Later studies demonstrated that inducing people into a state of boredom can lead them to administer electric shocks. People who were made to watch a boring movie, which was watching a scene of someone playing tennis on loop for an hour, were more likely to shock themselves compared to people who watched either a sad movie or a neutral movie. And when bored, people with a history of self-injury were also more likely to shock themselves sooner. And they also shock themselves more frequently during the first 15 minutes of the boring film. It's possible that people who have a history of self-injury might have had less effective strategies for coping with the boredom. And this also suggests that there might be a relationship between these two behaviors outside of the lab as well. But by the time the boring movie ended, it no longer mattered whether a person had a history of self-injury or not. The people who were bored were more likely to shock themselves either way. And there was also some evidence that not only did the bored participants shock themselves more frequently, they also administered higher intensity shocks to themselves. So why is this? The people who watched the sad movie were no more likely to shock themselves than the people who watched the neutral movie. So this study suggests that shocks weren't used as a way to escape negative affect. Instead, it's been suggested that the people in the bored condition were seeking some kind of stimulation to break up the dreaded feelings of monotony. So moving on to a different category, boredom has also been associated with behaviors that are often observed in eating disorders and might give us a clue to some of the motivations for disordered eating. Although there are several different types of eating disorders, a behavior that's commonly seen in binge eating disorder is frequently associated with boredom. So binge eating is defined by eating a much larger than normal amount of food in a single setting. It's characterized by feeling unable to control the behavior, and it's associated with feelings of guilt and shame in many cases. Binge eating can also serve to regulate high intensity emotional distress. So it may not come as a surprise to find that boredom proneness is predictive of emotional eating out of boredom. Even more interesting, though, is that boredom proneness is also predictive of emotional eating due to other negative states as well, such as sadness and anger. People who report more boredom over a week-long period have also reported eating more, both in terms of the overall number of calories consumed and also in terms of the amount of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates that they ate. So this suggests that experiencing more frequent boredom can be associated with eating larger amounts of food. And in support of this idea, research has shown that inducing people into feeling bored does lead them to eat more. In one of the first demonstrations of this effect, participants were asked to write the same two letters of the alphabet over and over and over again. The other half were asked to write short stories. In the room with all of the participants, there was a bowl of crackers. Not only were the participants who had to write letters repeatedly more bored, they also ate more crackers during the study. More recently, researchers asked participants to watch the boring tennis film on loop for an hour. The luckier participants got to watch a neutral movie. In this case, there was a bowl of M&Ms in the room with them. And again, people who had to watch that same tennis scene for an hour ate more M&Ms. And then finally, there is some research showing that boredom can lead us to choose more exciting food options, which may not always be the healthiest choice. So if you only have options if the only options you have in your home are either unexciting but healthy or exciting but relatively unhealthy, you're probably more likely to go for the exciting one when you're bored. In the study that showed this, they used candy and crackers as those two options. But the same study also showed that if you do have a relatively healthy but exciting food choice, boredom can lead to eating more of that food as well. In this study, they used cherry tomatoes as that example. So the distinction appears to be more about how exciting the food is rather than if it's healthy or unhealthy necessarily. So another area that's received a lot of attention in literature is the relationship between boredom and substance use disorders. So studies have shown that boredom is associated with higher rates of alcohol use, tobacco use, marijuana use, and opiate use, just to name a few. Studies have also shown that boredom is also predictive of higher alcohol and tobacco use. So people who reported more states of people reporting boredom over a week-long period also reported that the boredom preceded alcohol and tobacco use. In our study looking at boredom during the first few months of the pandemic, we asked people whether they experienced any changes in their substance use behaviors. Similar to other recent studies, we did find that substance use increased over the beginning of the pandemic. Many participants also reported that they were drinking more, smoking more marijuana, and using more other drugs more frequently compared to what they were doing before the pandemic had started. But we also found that people who were more boredom prone reported greater changes in their substance use behaviors. Specifically, the higher boredom prone they were, the more likely to report that they had an increase in their use of alcohol, marijuana, and other drugs. And the same pattern was found for people who were reporting higher rates of recent boredom episodes. They also reported that they believed that they had increased their drinking, marijuana, and other drug use since the pandemic started. And finally, in addition to substance use disorders, boredom has been associated with behavioral addictions as well. Things like sex addiction, compulsive shopping, and gambling disorder. Studies have shown that people who are more susceptible to boredom report higher rates of problematic gambling behaviors. Like the relationship between electric shocks and boredom, it suggested that people use gambling to alleviate the low arousal state that's associated with boredom, rather than to escape the negative affect that's associated with it. So in our lab, one of the areas we look at is the association between boredom and compulsive object hoarding or hoarding disorder. This is a disorder that's characterized by persistent inability to discard possessions, even those that have objectively low value. In up to 85% of cases, hoarding is also associated with the excessive acquisition of new but not needed possessions. These difficulties discarding and this extreme acquisition lead to excessive clutter in the person's home that can look something like what's on the slide here. In severe cases, the clutter leads to non-functional living environments where the person can't use spaces in their home the way they were intended to be used. For instance, maybe they can't sleep in their bed because it's filled with clothes. Maybe they can't cook in their kitchen because there are piles of paper covering the stove and the countertop. Maybe they can't even get into certain rooms because there are boxes and papers piling the hallways and blocking a door. So our research has focused on how boredom might be interacting with several risk factors for hoarding symptoms. Individuals who struggle with compulsive hoarding often have difficulties in several different areas. And there are a few ways that boredom might be making these existing difficulties worse and contribute to more severe hoarding symptoms. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to go into these today, but the three broad areas that this can happen, that we think can happen, are information processing problems, maladaptive emotional responses and patterns of behavior, and then also the very meaning of possessions. As you can see on the picture from the previous slide, hoarding can make your environment pretty non-functional. And as a result, you may not be able to use things in your home or engage in activities the way you normally would. And it's one possibility is that this can set the stage for boredom to arise. And then we kind of might get something like a vicious cycle where hoarding makes boredom more likely to occur. And then in turn, the boredom makes the hoarding symptoms worse. For example, what we've seen today that people will engage in all kinds of behaviors to alleviate boredom, whether it's alcohol use, drug use, excessive food consumption, or even electric shocks. For people with a hoarding problem, their go-to behavior for managing boredom might be acquiring new items. And as more items are purchased and the clutter continues to build, this sets the stage for more boredom episodes to occur. And ultimately, that makes it even more likely for another acquiring episode to occur. So in order to find out whether hoarding and boredom do share a relationship, we have run several studies. In our first hoarding study, we examined a small group of older adults who were getting therapy for hoarding disorder. At the beginning of this study, we had 29 people who on average were 67 years old, and most of them were female. Before starting the treatment, participants filled out several self-report questionnaires that measured factors that were thought to be related to hoarding symptoms. These included symptoms of depression, indecisiveness, deficits with self-control, loneliness, and social support. We also used a measure of boredom that asks participants to rate the frequency, intensity, attributions, and unpleasantness of their recent boredom episodes over the past 2 weeks. The participants were then asked to complete these same self-report questionnaires after they completed the treatment. Unfortunately, though, a lot of participants did drop out of the study, and by the end, we only had data for 12. But we did find some interesting results. Before the participants started treatment, hoarding severity was associated with many of the areas we expected, including depression, deficits in self-control, and indecisiveness. There was also a tendency for participants with more severe hoarding symptoms to report slightly more loneliness. We also found a relationship with boredom. Specifically, people who reported more recent state boredom also reported more severe levels of clutter in their homes. When we gave participants the questionnaires again at the end of treatment, we found that many of those previous associations disappeared. Symptom severity was no longer associated with depression, indecisiveness, or loneliness. People who had higher levels of clutter in their home at the end of treatment and more severe problems with acquisition at the end of treatment also reported more boredom. So one possibility is that boredom was associated with poorer response to treatment in this group. And this was our first clue that boredom might be a relevant factor to look at when we're looking at hoarding disorder outcomes. So although this study gave us a starting place, it was limited in a lot of ways. Not only did a large number of participants drop out, but it left us with several unanswered questions. First, we found a relationship between more severe hoarding symptoms and boredom. But all of the participants in our study had some degree of hoarding symptoms. We still didn't know if people who struggle with compulsive hoarding have higher levels of boredom than people without the disorder. Related to that, we only looked at frequent episodes of state boredom. We still didn't know whether this was just a result of their environments being relatively uninteresting because of all the clutter, or because people with hoarding symptoms actually have a vulnerability to boredom. So we needed to take a look at boredom proneness. And then finally, we only used self-report questionnaires, which are where participants reported their symptoms themselves and answered questions. In hoarding disorder, a common problem is that people do tend to minimize their symptoms and may not have all that much insight into how problematic their hoarding behaviors had become. So we wanted to try to study hoarding behaviors rather than just reports of symptoms. So our next study attempted to answer those questions. In this study, we collected data online from 3 separate groups. We had a hoarding group, which had 56 people. Most of the people in this group identified as white and female, and were about 34 years old on average. These were participants who reported that they had current hoarding symptoms and also ones who scored above a clinical cutoff that was meant to screen people with hoarding disorder. In our previous hoarding symptom group, we had 43 people who on average were white and male and about 31 years old. These participants endorsed having a history of hoarding symptoms, but stated that they no longer struggled with compulsive hoarding. And then finally, we also collected data from a non-clinical group. This was our control group, and it had 61 people who on average identified as white and female and had an average age of 44. People included in this group reported that they had no hoarding symptoms and no history of symptoms, and also scored below a cutoff of symptoms. So when we compared these three groups in terms of their recent experiences of state boredom, we replicated what we had found in our previous study. As you can see from the slide here, participants with no history of hoarding symptoms reported much less boredom over the past 2 weeks. But people with current or past hoarding symptoms were about equal to each other and reported pretty high levels. We also compared the three groups in terms of boredom proneness. Here we found very similar results. Participants who had no history of hoarding symptoms were also much less boredom prone. On the other hand, we again found relatively high levels of boredom proneness for people who had either current or past hoarding symptoms. Last, we wanted to see if we could find a relationship between hoarding and between boredom and hoarding behaviors. So we asked all participants to perform an online task that was designed to assess problems with acquiring and difficulties discarding. In this task, participants were presented with 25 household items that varied in terms of their value, attractiveness, and usefulness. They were told that they could take whichever ones they wanted for free. Participants then clicked a button to decide which one they wanted to take and which ones they wanted to leave behind. The number of items that they decided to take was used to measure their acquiring behaviors. Next, they were told to imagine that they were doing some spring cleaning in their home and they had to get rid of some of their possessions. They were again presented with 25 various household items, and this time had to decide which to keep and which to throw away. The number of items that participants decided to throw away was used to measure problems with discarding. An example of one of the discarding trials from the study is up on the screen here. And in this study, we found that boredom is also associated with this measure of hoarding behavior. Specifically, the higher the level of the participants' boredom proneness, the more items they took and the fewer items they threw away. Similarly, more recent state boredom the participant had, the more items they took and the fewer items they threw away. So this brings me to the end of the talk. I hope that you saw today just some of the reasons why we should be paying attention to boredom. It's often brushed aside as a transient, innocuous state, but it actually might play a much bigger role in our lives, not just in terms of our mental health, but it may even shape the way we process something integral to our experience as the passing of time. So I hope this talk didn't bore you too much, but if it did, at the very least, I hope you'll walk away with a curiosity about why that is and what the experience of boredom means to you. Thank you so much, everybody. I would love to hear your questions. And if you have any additional questions after the talk is over, you can email me. My email address is up on the slide here.
Thank you very much. So we'll be ready to take questions. Thank you very much, Emily. I have a few, but we'll see if there's some. Don't hesitate to ask in the Q&A question. And if anyone here has a question.
I see one question that says, how did Scarlett in their study of the clock unexpectedly fast or slow? So I will go back to that slide. I just want to make sure I'm getting the right study. Is this the study? Okay. Great. So the question is, how did Scarlett in their study move time unexpectedly fast or slow? Was it a rigged clock? So that's a great question. So the actual, to my knowledge, the only study that has actually rigged a clock is the study that was conducted in the 1970s. The way that these researchers manipulated time perception was very similar to how we did it in our study, where what they did was they told participants inaccurate information about how much time would pass. So in one case, they did what we did, where everybody did the task for the same amount of time, but they were given different instructions about how much time it would take. And then in some of their studies, because this was 3 separate studies, they also saw if they could do it the other way, where they gave everybody, where they had everybody perform the task for a different amount of time, but told them the time was the same. So let's say everybody was told they would perform the task for 10 minutes, but some performed it for 5, others performed it for 20. So they did it both ways.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have one while other people are thinking. How did you make the connection between boredom and different psychiatric issue? Because it seems like it makes sense once you think about it, but how did you kind of figure this out before?
That's a great question. So that's something that, in terms of aside from hoarding disorder, the relationship between boredom and different forms of psychiatric conditions has been documented in the literature for decades. And so when I started out my research, really just doing a lot of reading in the studies that had been published already and seeing the different ways that boredom has been linked to other forms of psychopathology was really helpful for thinking about my own research. And it is something that does make a lot of sense. And just from my own experience in clinical work, we're doing DBT. It's very common that patients will report boredom leading to things like binge eating, for instance. So it definitely is something that makes sense and something that I wish was given more attention in mental health settings.
Yes, thank you. Yes. We have a question here.
Questions. Thank you very much for that. You hear me? Is that all right? One. Hello? Yeah, one question
yes,
I have is the following. Okay, I've got 2. But the first is, do you, as a psychologist, do you see that maybe shaping time perception would be useful, I guess, maybe in a clinical way, in a treatment related way, to address the various conditions that you mentioned that are linked to boredom? Because your presentation leads us to draw the conclusion that there's definitely a relationship between experiences of state boredom in particular, I think, and time perception. And so therefore, would it make sense to do something about intervening at the level of time perception in order to address the various conditions that arise from boredom? Second question, if I may, and one that kind of persisted throughout the talk, was would it make sense in your view to introduce culture or cultural variables into the mix of explanation of people's reading of time, experience of time, perception of time? It seems to me that that popular culture, for instance, has some kind of role, and I think it would probably be difficult to really test that, but I think it's also widely assumed that our perceptions of time vary according to our cultural circumstances. And those cultural circumstances will obviously vary depending on a number of things, like the context in which one experiences culture, age, as well, the one's, the setting within which one lives, and the way and the kind of cultural ambiance of the cultural circumstances of that setting. But it seems to me that culture has to necessarily play a role in that, and I'm wondering whether you think it would be useful to incorporate culture into the mix of explanation and understanding. Thank you.
Those are great questions. So for the first question about kind of looking at the intersection between boredom and time perception and boredom and mental illness, one thing that comes to mind for me, I think, first of all, I think that's a really interesting idea. It's not something I know all that much about, how those two different things can come together. One thing that comes to mind for me, though, is research on that, how mindfulness has an inverse relationship with boredom. And mindfulness is also something that, has been shown to be effective in working with certain mental illnesses as well. And it's something that's a core part of DBT as well. So I'm wondering, I think maybe that might be a place for a connection, because being mindful, you're kind of focusing very much on the present moment and on what you're doing in that moment. And I think that might be one place that these things can kind of connect. So that's a really interesting question. I wish I had a more comprehensive answer for that, but those are just kind of my thoughts on that. As far as the other question about culture, I think that also is a wonderful question, and something that admittedly I think is missing from this presentation is, how does this look in different cultures? Most of this research has been, especially on the time perception research, I would say, has been conducted in the United States, Canada, and Europe. But how would this look in cultures that are very different from these? And again, that's something I wish that I had a more comprehensive answer for, but I think it definitely does play a role. And maybe if I were to do this talk again, I would want to find out a little bit more about how this can differ in culture to culture.
Thank you, Emily. We have a few questions. I'll read them out for the people who don't have access to the chat. So we have John Eastwood asking, what in your view are the important next steps for understanding boredom and time perception? He also said it's a great presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Eastwood. So I think that's a great question. And I would say that maybe one of the next important steps in understanding this relationship would be to design a study where this is looked at in more ecologically valid conditions, because to my knowledge, most of this research has been conducted in a lab setting where participants are brought in. So maybe being able to find a way to do an EMA study that's looking at this kind of just in people's daily lives might be an important next step for better understanding how this relationship looks outside of the lab setting. Might be one.
Thank you. So we have Sean Robert here, says, how can we pay attention to boredom? He says, I personally can get over it because I'm not conscious of the time I'm spending. And when I pay attention to it, I immediately discarded it.
Interesting. So that's a really interesting question. So I think kind of going back to maybe what I was talking about in relation to the intersection between time perception, boredom, and mental illness and mental health might be mindfulness, because studies have shown that there is this inverse relationship between, if you're more mindful, you're often less bored. So maybe consciously paying attention to being mindful and focusing on the present moment might kind of be one way to combat boredom, especially in situations where you can't change your environment. Like if you're doing something that you're finding boring and you can't leave, being kind of very mindful of just experiencing things in your environment. So describing things in your environment, describing your internal sensations to yourself might help to bring more awareness to when you're feeling bored, and also might be a way to reduce it in some cases.
Thank you. Do you have many more questions? Oh, there's another question. We have Jeffrey Sims. Thanks, Emily. Very good presentation. Does it help in any way to understand boredom as an intense human experience, or instead the lack of an intense experience? Your talk appears to suggest the latter, but could it be also the former? Or does it matter too much to categorize in this way? Does it matter too much?
Thank you. Another great question. So that, is actually something that this might be kind of getting at what you're saying. In the research, there has been studies showing different results about whether boredom is a low arousal state or a high arousal state. So it's one of the many things about boredom where researchers have found different results and are still trying to come to a consensus on how actually do you characterize boredom. For instance, there are some researchers that have studied and believe that there are different types of boredom that can differ in terms of their valence and things like that. So I think that's an excellent question. And I think it's definitely possible that maybe if boredom could be categorized as more a high arousal state, it might be more characterized as an intense emotion in that case.
Mhm. Maybe I have time for one. Yeah, I have a quick one. I'm just thinking about, you're saying we don't talk about it enough and don't take that into consideration, because I feel like there were a lot more teenagers throughout the pandemic that increase in their substance abuse, being kind of stuck at home without their parents, and had more, like we see a very big increase in anxiety and stress and depression. And I wonder, how can we kind of shed a light to it through the lens of boredom, and how can we deal with it now? Like, what would be ways that we can address that?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question. I think in general, maybe one way to kind of increase awareness of boredom in mental health settings would be, a lot of times when people present to mental health clinics or therapy or things like that, they often fill out information like demographic information. They might fill out symptom questionnaires. Maybe assessing their levels of boredom in their life might be one way to start paying more attention to how boredom might be playing out in things like depression and substance use. And I think one way for, people who are in this state now of the pandemic and having much less access to things that they normally would have access to, and kind of seeing this increase in substance use and things like that, might be to really kind of bring more awareness to boredom to these people and to people who are experiencing it, and then offering some strategies or ways to kind of cope with boredom effectively, like alternative coping strategies for boredom.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question from the audience.
This thing works?
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's a correlation between social media and boredom, right? Or I'm pretty sure that's a scientifically proven thing. I'm not 100% sure on that, but does that mean that it might be sort of not necessarily about the content of the media that correlates with depression, but more about the fact that it lowers your attention span, meaning that possibly social media could be as harmful as any other content that systematically lowers your attention span?
Great question. So I think sorry, I got distracted by something in the chat, but I think that that's a really great point. And kind of like I don't know if you were able to see any of the other talks this week, but Dr. Mann, who presented on Tuesday morning, was talking about a lot how one of the issues with boredom is that we don't have enough of it, so we don't learn how to tolerate it effectively. And I think that might be one reason why social media plays a big role, because it's constantly accessible, right? It's on your phone, it's on your computer. You can log on to one of many social media apps at any time and just scroll. And so that really kind of takes away from having to deal with boredom or cope with boredom. And so I think in some ways, just the constant accessibility of it is playing a role. I do also think that the content can be in some cases playing a role as well, especially with all of the other things that you see on social media, like social comparisons and cyberbullying and things like that. So I think both are important, but I think it definitely just the constant accessibility of it might be also contributing something as well.
Basically, social media would have a compound effect of both the content of it being harmful and the attention span lowering. And well, it doesn't let you, it makes you not be able to cope with boredom, and especially with young children can be a problem when you have, someone who's 4 or 5 who has an Instagram or whatever. They like, I see my little cousins, they scroll through YouTube and they very, like, it's very fast and it's very, and I mean, I guess this would keep causing this kind of correlation between lowering of attention span, because there's so much easy entertainment compared to, because you need to learn to be bored in order to be able to cope with it. So would that mean that sort of the, I guess, the increase in depression would be continue to rise in the future if that's the way our youngest kids are. You know, the attention span seems to be lower in the kids 10 years younger than me than it is even today. And it keeps going like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's been any studies looking at that specifically about like the compound effects of both the way social media operates and the content of it, but I think it is definitely a reasonable hypothesis that if things keep going that way, that people might become more depressed in the future. It's definitely hard to say, and it's a very interesting question though, and I think it's definitely something we should all kind of be paying attention to.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
so much.
questions. Thank you, Dr. Emily Weiss, for these insightful information. We'll see you, Lily.
That's
Thank
it.
you
I
so
just want to say
much.
we've run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I think it was very timely and very important for our students. Thank you guys for coming, for asking questions, for participating. Thank you for those of you who are at home. And hopefully we'll see you. We have a couple of more lectures this week, a couple more presentations. Hopefully we'll see you. Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure.